This week, I'll be delving into one of the most sensational and controversial paranormal stories from the 1970s. It is a story that set the stage for future tales and modern paranormal lore. Welcome to the channel, or welcome back to the channel. My name is Florio, and today we're going to be exploring the tragic story of the person behind The Entity, which ended up being a book and a film. You might be familiar with the film from, I think it's 1982. The Entity was based on the story of Doris Bither, a woman whose life was mired in despair and abuse. And the story is about the investigation that transformed her personal torment into a widely publicized paranormal case. This story intertwined with paranormal researchers Barry Taff and Kerry Gaynor and the UCLA Parapsychology Laboratory. This story is yet another tale of caution, showing what remains to those left behind when psychological torment intersects with those seeking paranormal answers and their golden ticket to Hollywood. So in this video, I'm going to unravel the different layers of this case, from its grim beginnings in a condemned home to the controversial claims of spectral attack and the scientific, psychological, and cultural legacy left behind by the investigators. As always with my videos, I start off by telling the story of what happened. Then we'll get into discussing the intricacies and the problems with this case and the controversies surrounding the investigators in the UCLA lab. And then we're going to analyze what evidence we have left behind. Fat cat. The initial story of Doris Bither. All right, just want to add a trigger warning for this story and this case. This case does discuss spectral SA, as well as, and I'm going to say these words weird for YouTube purposes, abuse, and substance abuse. All right. So those are your trigger warnings. If this story is not for you, it's totally understandable. You can catch the next video. Okay, let's get into Doris's story. The story of Doris Bither is at its core a tragic narrative, a life defined by relentless hardship, personal demons, and an environment so oppressive that the line between logic and supernatural seemed to blur. Doris Bither was a California woman whose troubled life was steeped in abuse, alcoholism, and dependency of substances. She had multiple failed marriages and a lifetime of mistreatment, and that set the stage for an existence filled with despair. Doris lived in a condemned, dilapidated home in Culver City, California. The home was so deteriorated that it provided little more than a crumbling shelter for the family. In this squalid environment, she raised 4 children, 3 sons between ages 10 to 16, along with a preteen daughter. The dysfunction within the family was palpable. The home, riddled with neglect and decay, soon became the backdrop for a series of paranormal experiences that would shock the public and challenge conventional explanations. The Bither household was far from ordinary. According to Doris's own accounts, the quarters of their home were haunted by semi-transparent apparitions, ghostly figures that roamed the dimly lit hallways. But the haunting went far beyond mere sightings of shadows or flickering lights. This case was a bit different because in this case, Doris claimed that these spectral entities were not only present, but also malevolent. In a series of harrowing stories, she details instances of physical attack by these invisible forces. On one occasion, she described being hurled across a room and slammed into the wall by an unseen force. Even one of her sons was said to have experienced a similar attack as well. Doris's testimony painted a grim picture. A life of horror in which the terror was not limited to psychological torment, but had manifested as physical attacks, and the most shocking part of this case was the spectral SA. This would come to define her story in the history books, as it was not only a frightening thought to those who heard the story, but eventually when the movie was made, the way it is portrayed in those scenes, it's very raw and quite unnerving to watch. The spectral SA became the shocking part of this case that stuck with many people years later, even being very similar to the Snedeker case in the 90s, to the point that people accused the Snedeker family of actually copying the story of The Entity. They even said that their favorite movie was The Entity as well. I'm going to refer to an article that Benjamin Radford published about this case in the Skeptical Inquirer. Ben is the guest I had on for the paranormal psychology video I did a few weeks back. Ben, in his article, remarked on the uniquely repulsive impulsive nature of her allegations, noting that her account, while sensational, also raised profound questions about the interplay between psychological distress and paranormal interpretation. So, back to Doris and her story. With conventional channels of help unavailable or unwilling to assist, Doris turned to a friend, Candy, for solace and understanding. Candy's involvement would soon spark a chain of events that transformed a personal tragedy into a public spectacle. As her story spread, Doris Bither's experiences captured the attention of paranormal investigators and the media alike, setting the stage for one of the most debated cases, but also the unfortunate forgotten victims of the paranormal investigators who just seemed to be seeking fame. The Lurid Claims. Just to touch on this a little bit more, because this is what makes this case a little bit unique. The sensational and controversial aspects of the Doris Bither case are the claims of the spectral SA, and that is what kind of got this case's notoriety. According to Doris's testimony, on multiple occasions she was attacked by 3 semi-visible entities. She describes 2 smaller ones restraining her by her wrists and ankles, while a larger presence was over top of her and attacking her. These alleged encounters left her with large discolored bruises on her body, particularly around her wrists, ankles, chest, and inner thighs. Barry Taff noted that this particular claim was the most dramatic of all the reported phenomena. Yet he expressed skepticism about the veracity of the claim, noting that it's all largely unsubstantiated. Since the alleged attacks occurred weeks before the investigators arrived, the bruises were healed. And since Doris refused to go see medical help when it happened, there's just no proof that these bruises even existed. And thus, the question of whether these attacks truly happened comes up. Because Doris was drinking a lot and she could have been seeing something. She could have hurt herself. There's lots of other explanations it could have been. Critics and scholars have often noted that while paranormal SA does occur sometimes in ghost lore throughout history, it's also one of the most difficult phenomena to document or verify. Folklorist Colin Waters, in his studies on these estual hauntings, has argued that many such accounts might be better understood as manifestations of suppressed emotions or unconscious fantasies rather than literal events. Even look, for example, the Bell Witch. There's a bit of question to that as well. So it does happen sometimes in history. In the context of Doris Bither's life, a life marked by severe emotional and physical abuse, substance dependency, and profound personal instability, these interpretations could very well apply here as well. Ultimately, while the lurid claims of spectral SA have contributed significantly to the case's notoriety, the lack of evidence means that these allegations remain highly controversial. As Carl Sagan says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And in this instance, the evidence simply did not match the sensational nature of the accusations. The investigation. In 1974, the extraordinary claims emanating from Doris Bither's home in Culver City reached the ears of some of the Los Angeles' most dedicated paranormal researchers. The first one being Barry Taff, referred to as a renowned parapsychologist who was working out of UCLA's Parapsychology Lab. The lab was a facility operating under the guidance of the enigmatic Thelma Moss, which we're going to be covering in more detail in a future video I'm also planning as well. And joining him was Kerry Gaynor, a scholar with a background in philosophy and hypnotherapy. I believe he was referred to as a parapsychologist at some point. I'm not 100% sure, but mainly he's known as a hypnotherapist most of all. So it first started in a bookstore. Well, they were talking to one another about the subject of the supernatural. It just so happens Doris's friend Candy overheard them. She ended up approaching them and told them the story of Doris, hoping that they could help her in some way. They ended up taking the case to Thelma Moss, their supervisor of the lab, and got permission to pursue it and investigate it. So together they embarked on what ended up being a 10-week investigation of the Bither residence, beginning on August 22nd, 1974. According to Doris, the attacks started a few months earlier, and they included, among other things, objects moving on their own, random foul odors, unusual noises with no point of origin, and the multiple instances of physical attack and SA. Doris said that everything was escalating in frequency and intensity. When they first arrived at the home, they saw the condemned home in the state that it was in, and just it looked like it was in profound disrepair. Its crumbling walls, persistent cold spots, and foul odors could have been explained by the state of the home itself and not anything supernatural. When she told them first of the spectral essay, they referred her to a psychiatric facility at UCLA. They honestly thought that that would be the end of the story because they felt it was psychological. They didn't believe her when she was telling her story because it just seemed a little bit too crazy, right? A little bit too out there.
I went over to her house. We conducted about a 2-hour interview. And during that time, she told us a lot of interesting experiences, but I knew she was holding something back. And at the end of the interview, she finally admitted to us that she was attacked and raped by the ghost. At that time, we thought she was probably crazy.
But then 10 days later, she called them in a panic that everything was escalating again and she wanted their help. Now, I tried to look into it a little bit, and this case is older, so it's hard to find direct evidence, but I couldn't find what the psych clinic found or whether they checked in with psych afterwards. Like when they went back, did they check in to see if she even went? So we have to make assumptions on both sides when it comes to the follow-up on Doris's mental health. Taff and Gaynor did end up returning and investigating the home. They go on to report witnessing instances of poltergeist activity, objects inexplicably falling from shelves, cabinets that opened on their own, and even a frying pan that, in one occurrence, was seen flying along a curved trajectory, they said, before crashing to the floor. So they said that they witnessed these things themselves. Now, accompanying the investigators on several visits was Candy, the friend of Doris's who she confided her secrets in. Now, Candy claimed to have a unique sensitivity. Essentially, she claimed to be a psychic. So while they're investigating, she would shout out warnings such as there's something in the corner, and they would take pictures. But the investigators never really found anything substantial. There were some pictures that they thought maybe were proof, and we'll go over those as well at the end of this video. In an effort to document it all, Taff and Gaynor employed the technology available to them, which was an instant film Polaroid SX70 camera and a 35mm camera. As well, they also had an infrared camera. All the photographs they ended up capturing were really ambiguous. Instead of delivering clear images of spectral activity, the photos showed odd overexposed areas, circular bands of light, and irregular lines as well. These photographs get heavily scrutinized later, and they pretty much have said that a lot of the odd things about them can be attributed to common photographic errors. And we'll get into Kenny Biddle's analysis at the end of this video. He also then gets a few other professionals to look at the photos too. So it's pretty thorough. Now, Taff and Gaynor, they talk about Doris being a private person and that she didn't want to go into detail about her real life and her psychological problems. Because they wanted to investigate the home, I suppose, they thought it would help her in some way. So they didn't press her further on the psychology and her background and what happened in her childhood because she apparently had trauma. And it didn't seem like they really did a follow-up on the psych. So I found it weird that they mentioned that they even took her to psych, and I don't know, there's no real proof of it, so we have to take the word for it. Even after they found evidence of her substance use and the family dysfunction, they still did not revisit the idea of a psychological explanation. Barry Taff did end up writing that Doris's case, and I quote, was not, in my professional opinion, the result of spectral essay, but rather a disturbingly real poltergeist outbreak. So that was his initial statement that he told people, pretty much saying that it's confirmed poltergeist. They also apparently began seeing balls of light themselves, and they were convinced that they captured some in their Polaroid photos. So somewhere along the line, it seems they lost the plot, but it may have been when news and crowds started to gather outside the home. Barry ended up becoming like the spokesman to the family and to the story, kind of like, I guess he was kind of acting like Ed Warren, Lorraine Warren. However, the woman who ran the UCLA lab, Thelma, she ended up visiting the home to see why they were spending so much time on this case. During her visit, she witnessed no paranormal activity, and thus she pulled the plug to get the team to come back to the lab and stop wasting time on something they were unable to prove. This left the family with no help in the end, but lots of eyes on them and scrutiny by the public. Soon after, though, the book and the movie would come out. I couldn't find any information on whether Doris received any royalties for her story, and if she did, how much did she get compared to the investigators. The author of the book and the screenplay is Frank D. Felita, and he was part of the investigation team. As you know, what I I didn't really point out yet is that the investigation team was everyone at the lab and other people that they could find useful. So they said it was somewhere between like 20 and 30 people were in that little house investigating together. So Frank happened to be on the team of the investigation, and then he ended up writing the book.
Frank DiFelitta, the author of Audrey Rose, was also witness to the phenomena. His incredible first-hand experience in the Culver City, California house inspired him to write The Entity, which was later made into a motion picture.
All the instruments started clicking away. So I knew everyone was seeing this at the same time that I was. They were ducking, and everyone was saying, oh my God, look at that, oh my God.
So he probably made the most money. I found an obscure article that is in German that talks about Doris didn't receive any royalties from this, and she actually stayed on welfare for the rest of her life. So I don't know if that's true because I couldn't really find anything to substantiate it. Mary Taff and Kerry Gaynor, the original investigators, they probably got a piece of the book or the movie, who knows. But they got famous. Their names got famous because of it. So Barry ended up becoming a professional paranormal investigator, but was also part of Hollywood and worked on many movies. And then Kerry, he did do some investigation stuff, but he kind of built a name for himself and he became a hypnotherapist to the stars. So they did take advantage of their fame to gain something out of it. It would seem Doris is the only one that didn't get anything from this, but that is as per usual with these stories. Unfortunately, the families end up getting screwed in the end. Barry Taff, in his numerous writings, he has a book called Aliens Above, Ghosts Below. He describes the investigation as evidence of a poltergeist infestation. Yet, as the time has passed, nearly 50 years later, he now says that much of the evidence remains unverified. So he seems to have changed his story now that enough time has passed. With many of the key participants in the story now gone and only really fragmented accounts and stories are left behind, the true nature of the events at the home remains a topic of heated debate to its authenticity. People don't really know, is it paranormal or is it psychological? Psychological explanations and critiques. Somewhere along the way, it would seem investigators Taff and Gaynor didn't think to seek additional psychological help for the Bither family. Instead, they saw a golden opportunity to sell a story. A critical review by researchers such as Benjamin Radford has led many to consider that the paranormal phenomena reported in the Bither case was significantly influenced by the psychological state of the family itself. Doris Bither's life was defined by extreme distress. She grew up in an environment marked by abuse, substance misuse, and neglect. It isn't surprising that her perceptions of the world might be distorted and she might be mistaking things going on around her, especially considering she's not sober. There is an interesting concept called haunted people syndrome, which is a condition in which individuals under extreme psychological duress begin to interpret ordinary occurrences as supernatural. This has been discussed in various academic circles. When people are in this state, even mundane events like a cabinet door swinging open due to a draft or a misplaced object falling, they can be misinterpreted as paranormal manifestations. As well, having a sensitive friend or psychic friend there calling out shadows and, playing into the whole delusion, and the paranormal investigators are there too. It just further presses Doris and her family into the delusion that something is happening. Where this family needed psychological help, she instead became surrounded by spiritual answers that did not help her in any way. Academic research published in journals such as Mental Health, Religion, and Culture has pointed to the extreme stress within the Bither household as a significant factor. Constant interpersonal conflict, along with the effects of long-term substance use, likely heightened the sensitivity of those living in the home to any stimuli that was going on. And here's where you have to apply Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. And this would suggest that many of the bizarre occurrences attributed to paranormal activity were in fact just the result of everyday psychological phenomena misinterpreted under duress. Barry Taff, who claimed to have investigated thousands of paranormal cases throughout his career, he admitted that many of the answers that they received during the Doris Bither investigation, and he said, and I quote, could not be confirmed and never really made any sense, end quote. And all of these statements that he now says pretty much negate the original proclamation of the home being a poltergeist haunting, as he announced to the press at the time and as he sold the story. Such admissions underscore the difficulties in proving paranormal phenomena, especially when the available evidence is largely anecdotal and heavily reliant on subjective testimony of individuals under severe psychological stress. As well, this underscores the fact that you got to question what was the paranormal investigators' true motives. In reviewing the case, experts like Ben Radford have suggested that the extraordinary claims of spectral SA in particular, they may be better understood as a complex interplay of psychological trauma, suggestion as well. You have your psychics and paranormal investigators in there, and misperception. While the claims themselves are undeniably dramatic, the absence of physical evidence to corroborate the claims is a shortcoming of the investigation. And this just points us towards non-supernatural explanations. In a household rife with dysfunction, even the most sensational paranormal accounts can often be traced back to the human mind's desperate attempt to make sense of overwhelming pain and confusion. The house was very chaotic. It wasn't a good place to be. The family wasn't doing well. She grew up in a bad situation. She married into multiple bad situations, and the family and the kids they were fighting all the time. It was a very dysfunctional house.
Initially, they would say, well, you're hallucinating. So then I would look at them and say, well, we've got 20 witnesses. And they would say, well, then it's obviously mass hallucination.
I'm just adding this section here because this case is older and there wasn't a lot of technology around at the time. There just really isn't a whole lot of evidence for us to go off of other than anecdotal accounts. That being said, there are a few key things that I think I am saying are questionable, but I can't get enough information on them to really prove either way. So I'm just going to talk about a couple things here, and namely the first one is Candy, Doris's friend, was an apparent psychic. And you guys know how I feel about psychics. And my thoughts on this, I tried to find more information about her and I couldn't find it. But my thoughts on it, between a psychic in the house who's furthering her delusions and then a paranormal investigation team who's taking her account seriously, thus furthering her delusions. And they also aren't pressing her for any of her psychology issues, any of her psychological issues. And it doesn't seem like they actually followed up or even encouraged her to go seek help, and she wouldn't actually go to a doctor, and she's recorded as saying that. So it's a combination of these people who are giving her positive feedback that they're listening to her story and they believe her, and the issue might as well be that she's hallucinating. She was using substances at the time and she was drinking a lot, and that alone can cause hallucinations. Even drinking a lot can cause confusion, and then you think something's happening when it's not happening. Or imagine if you're using that stuff and let's say you suffer from sleep paralysis, like I do. I suffer from it. And then if you're inebriated in some way, that sleep paralysis could seem like some beings are attacking you and you're just not in your right mind to actually logically say, oh, okay, that was in my sleep, because you're just inebriated too much, right? So I think there's an issue there with the Candy situation, and I would like to know more about her as a psychic. But the paranormal investigators going in there, not pressing her to go get psychological help, I think is an even worse situation. And I tried to dig up as much as I could on that. There just isn't really a whole lot to go off of. Now, the next area I want to talk about is I just want to touch on her son and the things that her son was saying after she passed. I am aware that there's a story that her son told after she passed, saying that her life was filled with other hauntings and that she was into the Ouija board, a bunch of stuff like that. I'm not going to cover that I'll put the link to this here. He says he's writing a book and the son is writing a book about what really happened. And I don't believe it, because none of this stuff was brought up at the time of, and he waited to come out after she passed, and then he's trying to sell a book. Also, just adding one last point as well, a lot of kids that are involved in these haunted houses and ghost stories, they seem to misremember what happened back when they were younger. Their mind is altered, and you can see there is psychological proof of this like being a thing. It also explains like the satanic panic and a bunch of other things where kids, they misremember stuff because it was programmed into them to remember things in a certain way. So when these kids grow up, a lot of times from these haunted houses, they have memories of the stuff that their parents and other people admit to making up, to faking, because when they were younger, they were traumatized that this happened around them. And it is actually a psychological thing that happens quite often. So taking a child's account after they've grown up and everything, like, you just got to take it all with a grain of salt and not take it seriously, because most of the time, almost always, they misremember everything. I'll add this link to my references as well, but I just don't really believe a lot of the sensational claims in here. The biggest thing to pull from this article, however, is that Barry does talk about how he didn't press her for her background and what went on in her life and why she was like not well emotionally and psychologically, because he was worried that they would be kicked out and they wouldn't be able to investigate. So that is a problem. You don't do that as an investigator. You do want to actually look into someone's background. As well, he does admit, Barry admits that they were unable to do any sort of neurophysical examination or bring her into UCLA to actually do a proper medical examination on her as well, because she refused that too. So there's a lot of balls being dropped during this investigation, assumptions being made, and just sensationalization to sell a story. And now her son's coming forward with this sensational story. Personally, I don't buy it. I don't know why he waits until she passes to come forward to write a book, and it just seems over the top. Like, he's like, oh, the Ouija board is to blame, this is to blame, like all this stuff was wrong with her. There was a woman who showed up at our door and warned us that the house was haunted, but it's like, is the house haunted or is Doris haunted? Because you keep jumping back and forth. It's up to you guys if you want to take it seriously. Yeah, okay, so I think if I get this right, I guess her eldest son is working with Xavier. Either way, the son is the one who's giving away the stories about her playing with the Ouija board in her earlier life, before they were born and before, she left home and then whatever. And I'm not really, yeah, he even mentions too in his article here as well that Barry mentioned to Xavier that, I guess the son is Brian, that he actually contradicted himself when he was interviewing. And that's what I found. Like, there's a bit of contradiction in this true story. And he's the only child who's come forward with this story. The other ones have not come forward with this. They aren't substantiating it. They aren't trying to sell a story. And I have no idea when this book is coming out, because this was like 2011 and they said the book was coming out next year. So I'm not sure what they called it. Anyway, I just wanted to add this in here because I'm not fully going into detail about covering this after the fact story, because I just don't believe it. So some of you may know about this story, and I just want to explain why I'm not going into detail about it. Biography of Barry Taff and Kerry Gaynor. Now, I want to touch on the investigators in this case. In the end, they are the ones who sold the story and seem to completely overlook, for some reason, the psychological issues going on. Even though they said that they got her psychological help at first, it doesn't really seem like they did any follow-up, and then they went back, investigated, and sold the story anyway. So I don't really know. There doesn't seem to be proof that they actually tried in the first place. And that's the problem with people chasing fame to be like the Warrens. It leaves destruction of families in its wake. As you've seen in many of my Warrens videos, a lot of these families end up broken after these investigators are done with them. So people need to be careful when they're doing this stuff. But let's get into who they are. Who is Barry Taff and Kerry Gaynor? And what can we learn about what type of people they are and their motives in their work in the paranormal? Barry Taff. Barry Taff entered the field with an impressive academic background. He has a doctorate in psychophysiology, accompanied by a minor in biomedical engineering. His early career was marked by a relentless pursuit of understanding the unexplainable. So he was working out of the UCLA's former parapsychology lab. Taff, and while he was working there, honed his skills under the mentorship of Thelma Moss. Her unconventional methods and belief in the application of the scientific principles to the paranormal phenomena profoundly influenced his and many others' approach. During his career spanning over 35 years, Taff has investigated, he says, more than 4,000 cases involving ghosts, hauntings, and poltergeist activity. Personally, I think that number sounds a little overexpanded. It kind of reminds me of the numbers that the Warrens throw around, but okay. So he would have to do 114 cases a year. Now, the thing is about these cases, like, there's travel involved. You don't charge people to do this stuff. He hasn't published multiple books or made multiple movies. So where was he getting the money to run around doing all these investigations? I just really don't think that he was able to pull off paying for travel for 114 investigations a year for the last 35 years. Not to mention the time out of his schedule too. Because again, you don't get paid for doing these investigations, and he didn't publish as many books or has done as many movies as the Warrens did. It was profitable for the Warrens, but it's not profitable for him if you look at his IMDb and the amount of books he's published, which has only been like 2 or 3. I just don't believe that he had the money or the means or the time to do 114 cases a year for the last 35 years. Even those fake ghost hunting YouTuber channels, they're only doing usually 1 case a week, and they're getting paid to do it with advertiser revenue from YouTube. And they're not doing 114 cases a year. It's hard to even find that many. And these ghost hunter YouTuber people, they're going to existing haunted locations that have a story behind them, and they're paying to spend the night too. So I just think that his number is definitely a lie. His research into telepathy, precognition, and remote viewing later contributed to government-funded projects like the failed project with the U.S. Army, the Stargate Project. And that project was trying to make effort that sought to harness psychic phenomena for intelligence purposes. And while he worked on the program and tried to help it, it is a failed program. It's been proven that they can't do it. In 1969, Taff was even the subject of a study published in Behavioral Neuropsychiatry, which examined his psychic abilities and helped launch his public career into parapsychology. And I found that, but he doesn't talk about being psychic much else in other places. So I don't know if he was a control subject. I'm not sure. I just did like a cursory dive into these guys. I didn't do like a full deep dive. Taff's writings, particularly his comprehensive book, Aliens Above, Ghosts Below, offer an in-depth account of his experiences and the many bizarre cases that he encountered. So again, some of this stuff is being pulled from his book, so it's also in his own words, right? During his career, he went from scientist to what seemed like movie maker. He worked on many films as an advisor of the paranormal, amongst other things. I'll bring up his IMDb on the screen too. You can see that he's been very busy in the entertainment industry. Kerry Gaynor. Kerry Gaynor is Taff's longtime associate and partner. He brought a different skill set to their investigations. He had a background in philosophy and training from the UCLA's Parapsychology Lab under Thelma Moss. Gaynor quickly developed a reputation for his calm, methodical approach to the paranormal. Unlike Taff, who is deeply entrenched in the empirical aspects of parapsychology, Gaynor's interests eventually led him into hypnotherapy, a field where he would later achieve recognition for his innovative approaches. Today, Kerry Gaynor is best known for the Kerry Gaynor Method, a 3-session hypnotherapy program that has helped numerous individuals quit smoking and vaping. And while he may not be working in the movie industry, his clientele isn't far from it. He sort of became the hypnotherapist of the stars, drawing praise from celebrities such as Martin Sheen, Aaron Eckhart, and Matthew Perry, amongst others. Despite his successful career as a hypnotherapist, Gaynor still worked with Taff sometimes on investigations. He says that he investigated nearly 500 reportedly haunted locations throughout Los Angeles with Taff. I think 500 is a more believable number. However, that's just LA, and I feel like that's a little bit high for just LA. Together, Taff and Gaynor became known as Los Angeles' original ghost hunters. Their collaborative investigations not only provided a window into the bizarre and unexplainable, but also laid the groundwork for many modern approaches to ghost hunting. Their original work, it was pioneering at the time. Nowadays, we know, has many shortcomings. but it does continue to influence both the paranormal community and academic discussions about the psychological intersecting with supernatural activity. So in the end, what are my thoughts on them? Even though you probably didn't ask, I'm still going to tell you anyway. In my opinion, they seem to be chasing the stars like Hollywood, in one way or another. They definitely cashed in on the fame and notoriety of the Doris Bither case. And they made good money after that along the way because their name got out there. I'm curious how many personal stories they sold to Hollywood and how much money did they pay all the families. Also, were all the families left with no answers to fend off the entities on their own, such as what they did to the Bither family? I am curious how much these guys are like the Warrens. If they really investigated 500 to 4,000 cases, how many families have they left just shattered in the end? Considering Doris last saw them at the screening of The Entity, they said that she moved after that and did not leave any way for them to contact her. I feel like that also says a lot. The fact that she was at the screening, I really do hope that it means that she got some money for her story, but her ghosting Taff and Gaynor afterwards, I think that answers a question as to the real motives and who Taff and Gaynor really are. UCLA Parapsychology Lab. So I wanted to add a little section here to discuss the UCLA Parapsychology Lab a little bit. I plan to do another video that'll be getting into more detail of the lab as well, because Thelma Moss, the one that was running the lab, she is the one that is said to have tested Lorraine Warren's psychic abilities. And I have a few theories about their true relationship. So that is going to be in a future video. That being said, I just wanted to kind of touch on the lab now because we're going to be referring to it again in other videos. So let me give you a very brief biography of the lab. If all else, I thought it just might be an interesting side tangent as well. The UCLA Parapsychology Lab was not merely an experimental space, it was a crucible of the unknown, a pioneering institution that challenged conventional scientific inquiry in the realm of the paranormal. I know when I was younger, there was a few labs and organizations like this, and I really wanted to go study at these places, but a lot of it was proved to be pseudoscience and kind of dropped by the time I was old enough to go and do this stuff. Because this lab in particular operated from 1969 till 1978. I wasn't even alive yet. The lab was situated on the 5th floor of the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, now known as the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. Despite its modest and cramped quarters, the lab became a hotbed for exploring phenomena that most scientists deemed unexplainable. And at the heart of the lab was Thelma Moss. Thelma was actually a former actress and scriptwriter who became a psychologist. She ended up doing a bit of an unorthodox career path, and that led her to the fringes of scientific research. Moss's early work in psychedelic therapy set the stage for her later interest in parapsychology, because at the time, LSD was starting to be criminalized, so they couldn't experiment with it. And all of it, whether the LSD experimentation or the parapsychology, all of it was controversial as it was intriguing to her. In 1966, after securing a teaching position in medical psychology at UCLA, Moss established an unsanctioned parapsychology lab. Driven by the belief that the scientific method could be applied to phenomena like ghosts, telepathy, and remote viewing, she ended up creating an environment that attracted a diverse mix of researchers, students, and even intelligence operatives. This was still at the time of the Cold War too, so, they were interested in any sort of upper leg up or whatever that they could get against the other side, right? Which is interesting because she did a lot of work still with the Russians, and this still was kind of Cold War territory. So I'll probably explore that a little bit more when I do a deeper dive on future videos. One of Moss's most notable research pursuits was Kirlian photography. It's a technique developed in the Soviet Union that purported to capture the aura of surrounded living beings, essentially like a picture of your aura, but it was supposed to be your bioelectrical field surrounding us. Not necessarily your aura, but they're trying to get a picture of the energy that emanates off of us, right? The electricity. Though later discredited by mainstream science, Moss's exploration of this phenomenon actually earned her international recognition. She ended up actually getting a prestigious award, the Douglas Dean Award from the United Nations in 1976. Her frequent travels to the USSR to work with Russian scientists on these topics, it further bolstered the lab's reputation as a place where scientific inquiry met the mysteries of the unexplained. And personally, I am curious because I would think that would have put her on a list, a watch list, because at that time with the Cold War kind of still looming, and her traveling back and forth there. So I'm kind of curious what the government thought about her truly. Under Moss's guidance, the UCLA Parapsychology Lab became a hub for innovation and investigation. Despite its contributions to the field, the lab was never without controversy. The methods employed were often rudimentary and lacking in rigorous scientific control, and they led to persistent criticism from mainstream academia. Essentially, they couldn't hold up against a peer review. Many of the phenomena recorded by the lab could not be independently verified, and as a result, the field of parapsychology remains a topic of debate even today. Once I finish working on that video that goes a little bit more into the lab and Thelma and everything, I'll link it as well to this video. So when it's ready, you'll see it linked. Analysis of the photos. In any paranormal investigation, photographic evidence can be as persuasive as it is controversial. In the Doris Bither case, the photographs taken during the investigation have long been a subject of heated debate. To shed light on this, we're going to turn to the detailed analysis performed by Kerry Gaynor of the Center for Inquiry. Many of you guys in this community already know of Kerry Gaynor. If you don't, of course, I'm going to link him and all his stuff below as well. He is on YouTube. Go check him out. So these photos, they're the only evidence that we actually have of this case. So it's good for us to review this and what Kerry found, because this really is the only evidence that we have. The first issue that Kerry addressed was the identity of the woman captured in the images. This is apparently a point of contention amongst different people. Many paranormal websites and publications have mistakenly identified the woman as Doris herself. However, according to Barry Taff's book, the photograph is not Doris, but is actually Candy, that psychic friend of hers, who was visiting on the night in question. So Taff explains, the story goes that Candy repeatedly shouted out during the night of their investigation, alerting to the group the presence of the entity and where it was located. So pretty much like shouting out, like, take a picture here, it's there, it's here, you know. And each time her voice rang out, Taff or Kerry quickly snapped a photo using the Polaroid camera. Out of 13 images reportedly taken that night, 6 show the entity in front of Candy's face. Apparently show the entity, but they're all overexposed. In contrast, there was 6 additional control photos taken when Candy indicated that the entity disappeared. And those photos appeared, they looked normal, they weren't overexposed.
She shouted out, "It's over in the corner." We fired our Polaroid camera in the direction that she said. We didn't see anything, but the picture came out bleached out white completely. She shouted out again, "It's in the corner." Again, we fired our camera and it was bleached out completely. At that point, I thought the camera was just malfunctioning. I waited till she said it was gone, and I took 2 control pictures. Those pictures are perfectly normal pictures. The only difference, she said it was in the corner in the first ones, and in these, she said it was gone. A few moments later, we felt a cold breeze of air coming through the door, accompanied by a horrible stench, a stench so foul, some people were vomiting. We fired the camera in the direction that that breeze was flowing towards us, and again, the picture was bleached out completely, except at the bottom of the doorway, you can see a little round ball of light. A few minutes later, she screamed out, "It's right in front of my face." We fired the camera, and the face was completely obliterated. But you can see the curtains behind her, you can see her dress. She shouted out again, "It's right in front of my face." Again, the face is completely obliterated. Now, those were her exact words. "It's right in front of my face." Once again, I wanted a control picture. I waited till she said it was gone, and I took the final picture. And this is a perfect, normal picture. It's just dark because we didn't adjust the setting. There's a scratch on it, which we put on it when we tried to clean it a little bit. But otherwise, it's a normal picture. The only difference between these two, in one, she said it was in front of my face. In the other one, she said it was gone.
This difference, though, is hardly evidence of a supernatural presence. Instead, it actually points to issues with the photograph process, essentially the person taking the picture. There's actually problems there, and Kerry found it. So Kerry ended up delving into the technical aspects by consulting the original Polaroid SX70 manual. So according to the manual, he ended up finding that the camera's light and dark control dial is positioned near the electric eye that automatically adjusts exposure. This allows the user to modify the exposure manually. Rotating the dial towards the white side lightens the exposure, while turning it towards the black side darkens it. This seemingly simple feature is very crucial. It means that an inexperienced operator could easily adjust the wrong dial, inadvertently altering the exposure of the picture. And this was like a new camera back then. Like they didn't know what they were doing with these cameras. They even said that in their documentation as well. Kenny notes that the 2 entity photos, the flash was used as well. And he can see that because the shadows are hard. So the hard shadows cast by Candy's silhouette. In one image, a hard shadow appears along her right side. In the other, it appears along her left. These shadows are consistent with the flash bar of the SX70 camera, which contains single-use bulbs on each side. But meanwhile, when you look back at the control photos, the photos seem to be taken under ambient light only. They lack the hard shadows, and instead they have softer, more natural shadowing, which means that they weren't using the flash. So this discrepancy tells us that these photos were not taken under identical conditions, so the control photos aren't really control photos. As Kenny explains, if one is to compare control photos with the images taken during the moments of supposed paranormal activity, they must be captured under the exact same settings. Otherwise, any anomalies observed could simply be the result of inconsistent camera use. So pretty much the control photos were taken without a flash, and then the photos where they caught something, an entity, they think, they were taken with a flash. So of course they look overexposed. But Kenny also made sure to go out and he consulted award-winning photographer Paul Michael Kane. Kane concurred with the analysis that the entity photos were indeed overexposed due to the flash, while the control image was underexposed, only lit by ambient light in the room itself. Kane made a note that the control image's lack of bright highlights strongly suggests that no flash had fired at all. So this whole thing, it just supports the notion that these photographs, the differences between them are either due to manual adjustments or error by the person taking the photo, not to the presence of a supernatural entity. There's also an intriguing discussion regarding the possibility of accidental or even deliberate manipulation, because the camera is designed in a way that they could have deliberately manipulated these photos. Barry Taff, though, he mentioned that the group had already ruined their infrared film through mishandling. This admission also makes you question the possibility of the camera settings. Could they have altered them intentionally or not between shots? Like how much were they messing with the film in these cameras? And maybe were they messing up the settings by accident? There were also photos that they captured of orbs and arcs of light, which they said that they saw themselves. But then later when they're recanting their statements, they seem to not be talking about these at all. So I don't know. But Taft's report describes an elaborate setup that he ended up doing to do this test. He did large black poster boards, white duct tape arranged in a grid, and numbered panels intended to standardize the photographic conditions during an intense period of paranormal activity. Essentially, he wanted like a grid, a black grid with white, and then he would take photos and he was trying to capture it and do some empirical stuff with it. However, these photos that he said that he did this with, when you look at them, this grid setup doesn't seem to be in place. So I'm not really sure why he even said that he had these photos, because they're not there. He didn't provide them in the end. So I don't really know where he was going on about with these photos, but it seems there was a lot of confusion in the evidence. And then with these light photos as well, Kenny actually suggested what I first thought when I saw these photos. It looks like a strand of hair is in front of the camera. I've taken photos like that by accident myself too. I have long hair, right? Most women have accidentally taken a photo like that. So Kenny ended up testing this with his wife. He took pictures with, a strand of her hair in front of the camera, and they look very similar. And that's what I thought when I was shown these photos too. So Kenny suggests in a chaotic environment like the condemned home, where over 30 people were milling about, because there was a lot more people than just them in there, it is entirely plausible that loose fibers, hair, or other debris could have inadvertently landed on or in front of the camera, especially if handled carelessly. These are old style cameras too. You gotta remember, these are not digital cameras, right? So furthermore as well, the negatives of these photos were sent to Adrian Vance, the West Coast editor of Popular Photography, and they were sent over by the investigators. So while Vance did publish one of the photos in the May 1976 issue of the magazine, his commentary wasn't great about it. Rather than endorsing the photo and saying, wow, this is amazing, it caught paranormal, whatever, instead he remarked that it appears that they may have had some success. He's pretty much saying I'm not sure about these photos, but maybe they're okay. Maybe they're real, right? So essentially like a very lukewarm kind of attitude towards it. That combined with the technical anomalies that we discussed as well, it does support the conclusion that photographic evidence is just really, it's likely the result of operator error. They used the equipment wrong, or maybe even they deliberately manipulated something. That's totally possible. It's definitely one thing it's not supernatural. Ultimately, while the photographs have captivated the imaginations of the paranormal community, their true story is much more mundane and simple to explain. As we reflect on the case of Doris Bither, we are left with a complex tapestry of unfortunate human suffering and the persistent allure of the unknown, as well as the draw of money and fame in Hollywood. The Bither case stands as a poignant reminder of how personal tragedy can sometimes be misinterpreted through the lens of the paranormal community. Scholars such as Benjamin Radford have argued that what we witness in these accounts is less a window into another dimension and more a mirror reflecting back the extreme psychological distress of those living in these unfortunate situations. In many ways, the story of Doris Bither and the subsequent investigation, it does serve as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And when a narrative is built on the fragmented and often unreliable testimony of a person whose life has been defined by hardship, the line between genuine paranormal phenomena and the distortions of a troubled mind, it becomes quite blurred. The sensational claims, no matter how dramatic, they must be scrutinized under the light of reason, scientific rigor, and psychological understanding. And when you find someone in that condition, you need to get them the proper help and not feed into their delusion. As we conclude our investigation today, we're compelled to ask ourselves, in the search for truth, how do we distinguish between the inexplicable and the misinterpreted? How do we honor the memory of those who have suffered while ensuring that our investigations remain grounded in rigorous evidence? These are questions that continue to challenge both paranormal investigators and skeptics alike. But tell me, what do you think about this case? Do you think that it was a real paranormal event, or do you think that it was more psychological, or do you have another take for it? Leave a comment below and let me know. As well, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe for future videos on topics like this. As well, I'd like to take a moment and thank my members. Your support means the world, and it really does help out the channel. Also, just a little reminder, membership, if you're wondering what it includes early access to videos. As well, there's special members only video at least once a month, sometimes more. And there's special access as well, where you get videos like a week ahead of time of everyone else. And also you have access to our recording sessions that we do once a month too. And those are a few of the member benefits. If you are curious about anything more, you can click on the join button below and it'll show you the different tiers and what they have. All right. Thank you guys for stopping by. Until next time, stay curious.